Hi friends, welcome to chapter 12, Using Language. In this chapter, what we will cover is essentially how to use language to develop our speeches and use that language to really bring imagery into the audience's mind. And so in order to do that, we first have to understand that language has a denotative and connotative level. And so we'll discuss that in this brief lecture. We'll also talk about the guidelines for using language effectively. And in order to do that, we'll cover some linguistic devices that we can use in our speeches to really take our speeches to the next level. And then lastly, we will touch on how to use appropriate language in our speeches. So let's go ahead and get started. So the denotative and connotative levels of language. So essentially, any word that you use in your speech will consist of these two distinctions. The first one is the denotative level. And this is the literal dictionary meaning of a word or phrase. So you could look up every single word that you use in your speech and get the definition of that word. Now, we know that when listening to a speech or when we're conversing with friends, we don't automatically go straight to the definitional meaning of a word. And so language has this connotative level. And this is essentially the meaning suggested by the associations or emotions triggered by the words or phrases. So think of a particular word and how it might be different from the denotative level and the connotative level. So essentially, the connotative level is what comes to mind when you hear this word, despite what the word actually means. And so it's like the emotional response of language. And so, as a speaker, we have to be in tune to the connotative level of interpretation that the audience might have regarding our language choice. So, we might be using appropriate language that is based on the denotative level, but when the audience hears it, it really resonates maybe negative emotion. And so we want to be careful of that. So when we are using language within our speeches, the textbook provides a few guidelines. And these are pretty generic, so we'll go through each of these and discuss how this might look like. So use language accurately. That seems like a no-brainer. But oftentimes there's a lot of ambiguity embedded in speeches if we don't carefully craft our speeches and that content. Um, we should use language clearly and vividly. So again, we want to paint a mental picture in the audience's mind. And the way we do that is through language. And then lastly, we want to use language appropriately. The last thing we want to do as a speaker is offend our audience or maybe exclude a particular demographic within our audience. And so we'll discuss more deeply about how to use language appropriately. So let's go ahead and look first at using language accurately and clearly. Essentially, there are two distinct categories. There is the abstract on one end of the continuum, and then there are concrete words on the other end of the continuum. So abstract words really references to general concepts, qualities, or attributes. Um, Whereas concrete words references to tangible objects. So think about sports. Sports is an abstract word that references to some sort of group of individuals engaged in some sort of competitive play. So it's really a general concept. Whereas concrete words would be, baseball or soccer, right? That is referring to a tangible type of sport. So let's go ahead and dig in a little bit deeper with some examples. So abstract. So here is a statement that is very abstract. The big vehicle started to move with tremendous force that caused a lot of smoke and noise. So what comes to mind when you hear that statement? The big vehicle started to move with tremendous force that caused a lot of smoke and noise. Well, uh, I don't know about you, but I wasn't thinking about SpaceX, the Dragon rocket that just launched 2 astronauts into space at the beginning of the year. I think it was in the beginning of the year. So when we look at this, is it a big vehicle? Yes. Is it moving with tremendous force? Yes. Is it causing a lot of smoke and noise? Absolutely, right? So we want to be careful because, in order to illustrate this picture through speech, it would be more effective to use more concrete, tangible objects such as, the rocket Dragon by SpaceX, launched into the sky carrying 2 astronauts, right? Okay. So abstract versus concrete language. So what we see here is this abstract ladder. So vehicle, very abstract. It's referring to a concept, something that, maybe transports or moves. Um, and rocket, see, we're getting more specific, right? But a rocket could, carry different payloads. It could be a bottle rocket, something that you light off at 4th of July, or it could be something that we launch into space. So again, we're getting more specific. Okay, space shuttle, now we're getting more concrete, and then SpaceX Dragon, the rocket, right? So now we're getting more concrete. So again, you might fluctuate between abstract and concrete language depending on the purpose you have as a speaker. So let's go ahead and move into using language vividly. Um, Essentially, there are a lot of different techniques we can use to liven up our speech. And so the first one are similes. And these are essentially comparison or approximations using like or as to signal a relationship between two things or two objects. So here's an example. Obtaining a college education is a difficult task. Like climbing Mount Everest, it requires sheer determination to reach unimaginable heights. So there we have it, a simile. We're comparing or approximating, our college education to freaking climbing Mount Everest, right? So, that is comparing two objects, like climbing Mount Everest and obtaining a college education. Hopefully, hopefully your college education experience isn't that difficult as climbing Everest. At least it felt like it for myself. Metaphors are very similar to similes, but the comparison between essentially the distinction is metaphors are a comparison between two unrelated things or concepts. And really the purpose of metaphors is really to use one concept to conceptualize another concept, a different concept. And so this takes more of like an equation approach in principle. So here's an example. Social media addiction is cancerous that rapidly spreads to other sectors of life, destroying users' attention spans, conversational skills, and relationships. So here we have a metaphor, social media addiction, uh, you know, comparing it to cancer, and that rapidly spreading cancer that just destroys life. And so here is a metaphor. We're using cancer as a concept to illustrate what maybe social media addiction is doing within our own lives. It destroys our attention spans. personally over the last few years, I've seen a decrease in conversational skills with students. Students come into the classroom and no one talks. They just whip out their phones and get sucked into a digital representation of reality. And also relationships. There's something called phubbing, where we divert our attention to our cell phones and essentially ignore our partners. And there's uh, growing research within that interpersonal field, and how social media and just our personal devices are affecting our personal relationships. So again, metaphors comparing two things, usually unrelated concepts, to drive understanding or to make a point. So let's continue on with using language vividly. Rhymes, these are patterns of sound created by choice or arrangement of words. And so we could maybe choose words that rhyme in order to drive a point. Parallelism is a similar arrangement of pair or series of related words, phrases, or sentences. So here in this example, we have rich and poor, intelligent, ignorant, wise and foolish, virtuous and vicious, men and women. It is ever the same. Each soul must depend wholly on itself. And so that parallelism between those first set of words, rich, poor, intelligent, ignorant, wise, foolish, virtuous, and vicious, are they're, parallel, and it's getting to the point that none of that really matters. We have to really depend on ourselves. Repetition is another, linguistic device that we could include in our speeches. And this is essentially reiterating the same word or set of words to, again, drive meaning or drive a point. So not now, when, or if not now, when, if not us, who, if not together, how. So we see that reiteration, if not, if not, if not. And that really enhances the vivid language in that statement. Continuing on, we see alliterations. These are repeating initial consonants in close or joining words. So this is essentially using clumps of three, and three words using the same first letter. So look at this statement. Nothing great is accomplished without cooperation, compromise, and common cause. So using those three words or sets of words, all starting with that C, create this vivid feel to the statement. So nothing great is accomplished without cooperation, compromise, and common cause. Right. So it just sounds excellent. And these antitheses, these are essentially a juxtaposition of ideas, usually in parallel structure. So, juxtapositions are essentially placing two things in comparison that are completely opposite. And so think of Neil Armstrong's famous words when he stepped foot on the moon. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, right? And so we're using that giant and small step and giant leap in juxtaposition to really bring to life that event. So when to use appropriate language? Essentially, when you're crafting your speeches, you have to really think about the occasion. Why are people here listening to the speech? Who are the audience members? Is this going to be family and friends? Is this colleagues, or is this potential, employers? What's the topic? What are you speaking about? Does that require a certain level of sophistication in how you present your ideas? And then, of course, the speaker, you as the speaker, what qualifications do you have? how should you be using your language? As an instructor, I'm always, especially within the classroom, I'm always struggling with this. Like at one point, I want to be, very intellectual, professional, but I recognize that, being that can really influence the relationship I have with my students. And so, but if I'm too casual and, maybe, use swear words, in my lectures and stuff, that might decrease my credibility, or maybe students might not take the content as seriously. And so, I'm always struggling with this, like, where do I find the balance, in using my language appropriately? And really, that depends on, again, the occasion, the audience, the topic, and the speaker. So moving forward within our speeches, um, I'm really going to be looking out for all-inclusive language within our speeches. I think this is something that we need to take into consideration, serious consideration, because I see this a lot. The most common thing that I see is the generic guys or he. So referring to the audience as guys, like, hey guys, or all of you guys. Um, that is one of my big pet peeves within public speaking, is because essentially by doing that, we're excluding all the females within the audience, or we aren't even taking into consideration maybe a third gender preference. And so, a simple way to use all inclusive language is just all of you, right? So when you introduce your speech, or when you're referring to the audience, just simply say all of you. We want to avoid man when referring to men or women. So oftentimes this comes up in outdated language and labels, such as fireman, mailman, some of those businessmen. Um, so we want to avoid that, and business leaders or firefighters or mail carrier, you know, um, those types of things. We want to avoid stereotyping jobs, social roles by gender, uh, just what I previously stated. We want to use names of groups used to identify themselves. So use names groups used to identify themselves. So um, you want to think about how maybe if you're talking about a group of individuals, let's say individuals. So, for example, just the other day, one of my students in a different class in a different campus is part of the deaf community. And so they like to refer to, their their community as deaf culture or deaf community. And so really using that to identify this particular group. And so you want to use the identifying labels that people prefer when referencing that group. So with language, with chapter 12 and using language appropriately, it really comes down to the more practice that you have with playing with the language or the vocabulary you use in the speeches, and how you craft statements. It really comes down to practice, and the more that you do it, the more creative you get. So I encourage you in the remainder of this semester, really start playing with some of these different linguistic devices and see how you can create a more lively, engaging, and vivid presentation. So in conclusion, I wanted to leave you with a quote from Walter Ong, and he spent his life studying language, specifically the distinction between oral cultures and literate cultures. And so Ong would state that human beings communicate in countless ways, making use of all their senses: touch, taste, smell, and especially sight, as well as hearing. And so, what really speaks to me about Walter Ong's quote here is that as individuals part of not only an oral culture but a literate culture as well, um, we can tap into all the senses of our audience members simply by the words that we choose to say in our speeches. So that's it for chapter 12. Again, take a look at the textbook, read through the chapter, and we'll see you next time.